It's really quite a momentous day besides my being here. It's election day. We had a lunar full moon actually really this morning a couple hours ago, and election day, of course. And oh, that's right, today's my wife and I are at 36th wedding anniversary, so. Might be classed as rookie by some standards, but nonetheless, it's been quite a journey. So, as Paul and Dick had mentioned, it really did come to me that there was no biography about Bob Steele, and I'm going to get into a little bit of Bob Steele's life, how the book came to be. I speak to the slides, so I try to stay on track with that, not get too carried away. But if you can hold your questions until afterward, I'll be happy to address anything, and encourage you to look up a little bit more about Bob Steele, because there's an awful great trove of information about his life at the Hartford History Center, which is on the 3rd floor, downtown Hartford at the Hartford Public Library. So without further ado. So as you can see, the idea behind the book came up in the summer of 2017. I don't usually get too involved with a lot of Facebook conversations back and forth. I put postings out myself, but I'm not too actively engaged in getting and running conversations. But a gentleman put a posting out there in late July of 2017, and he says, "Oh, sorry, I usually put a posting out to commemorate Bob Steele's birthday anniversary, which is earlier in the month of July. And for some reason, the occasion just struck me, and I decided, well, I'm going to chime in on this and say, I really think that Bob Steele should be a member of the Connecticut Hall of Fame. And there really is such a body. There really is such an entity. It's located at in one of the lobbies over the Legislative Office Building in Hartford, Connecticut. And from that, it just was kind of a groundswell of interest on my part, because I was in between book projects. And what I ended up doing was deciding I'm going to pursue this. I'm really going to find out what I can put together about the life of Bob Steele. Now, the photograph that you see there, you may have this in the Simsbury Public Library or a public library anywhere in the general area. I give a lot of credit to Phil Steele. He was one of the sons of Bob and Shirley, the third son, and he curated a massive amount, there's no other way to describe it, a massive amount of information that ultimately went into the 10-volume set that you see there. And Phil was actually going around to different towns. I believe this was around 2003, 2004. He took the time to curate all this in the 10 volumes, and there's just countless photographs. He took and transcribed diary entries that his father had made. And you can imagine over the lifespan of Bob Steele, who was over 90 years old when he finally passed away, you can imagine all the programs, all the ephemera that he had accumulated in the course of his life. Things like dinner programs, newspaper clippings, feature articles in magazines were written about him. Really quite a compelling life. But he curated all that information in 10 volumes and realized that the average person is not going to go out and spend $350 to buy the 10-volume set, which I did because that helped my research immensely in the course of writing the book. But what he did was he got a lot of public libraries to pay the money so that they would have those books on the shelf that anybody could just show up and look at them at leisure. But as an extension of that, I'm thinking to myself, the average person really is going to sit down and go through 10 books. But you can sit down and maybe a night or two go through a simple 1-volume biography and learn all about the man and how he came to be, where he came from, his life story, and the legacy that he built for himself. So my project began roughly around Labor Day, early September of 2017, and I finished in January of 2019. And the rest of the timeline is that the book finally was published in August of 2019, and I'm all excited because now I can start contacting various groups to see if they want to sponsor me to come in to give a talk about the book, talk about Bob Steele, maybe sell a book or two. I only have 2 books left, which I'll be happy to sell at the end of the program here, but I only have 2 of those left. But nonetheless, as I start doing all this campaigning, we get toward the end of 2019, I've got some great gigs booked. Senior centers, local libraries, Connecticut Historical Society did a wonderful gig for me. And then what happened in March of 2020, and everything just shut down. So I was able to do some sessions by Zoom, The Bristol Public Library in particular was very welcoming. We did a Zoom session, and for people that wanted to buy the book, I just brokered with them. I said, take the names of people, collect the money, I can drop the books off, and it worked out just well. So I overcame the challenge, but now I'm very happy that the run out is still that people find me somehow, and they're interested to have me come in to talk about Bob Steele. And in a way, this is sort of an extension of Bob Steele's legacy, because he spent who knows how many hours doing countless after-dinner programs, a lunchtime speaker at civic organizations and such. So I kind of feel as though I'm playing the role of Bob Steele today, and I'm very heartened by that. And again, thanks to those who invited me here. Bob Steele's early life. He's born as Robert Jesse Steele. We'll get to the rest of that in just a moment, but he's born as Robert Jesse Steele in Kansas City, Missouri, July 13th, 1911. He has a hard scrabble life because his parents end up divorcing when he's just a child. And back then, that was a relatively uncommon thing to have divorced parents. And he was an only child. He worked when he could to support his mother in whatever job he could find, sometimes rather menial, sometimes productive. But this forestalled his completing an education. So when he finally graduated high school, because he'd been working a little bit, going to school a little bit, back and forth, until he finally got his high school diploma. Some of you might remember that on air he used to joke about Robert L. Steele, HSG, with the fancy 3 letters at the end of his name. And what did the HSG stand for? Anybody know? High school graduate, yes. But now back to his middle name. He ended up changing that as he approached his teen years, early adulthood, because there was a neighborhood bully by the name of Jesse. He did not want to have that kind of association, so he became Robert L. Steele instead. His parents divorced. As a young child, he ends up discovering the medium of radio, and it's very interesting as I'm writing this book, understanding that when Bob Steele is born, there's really not much of a difference between his age and the creation of the media of radio. So this is a very interesting parallel track, and he built himself a crystal radio set, and he was able to listen to radio stations, the few that there were, but he entertained himself by hiding in a closet with the crystal radio set and imitating what a radio announcer would be doing. So we have a little bit of foreshadowing at a very early age of what Bob Steele is going to end up doing for a career. Mentioned again about his high school degree. And he did finally graduate, kind of sort of on time, in June 1929 when he was 18 years old. But we do have to take into consideration that back in that day, if you got anything beyond an 8th grade education, that was really something. So he was really quite proud of this, and he carried that on his sleeve because he also was a self-educated man too. He never stopped the learning process, and we'll learn a little bit more about that in a couple slides. But along the way, of course, as a manly man, he develops a love for motorcycles and sports. He likes boxing in particular. As we were talking at the head table a little while ago, he also enjoyed baseball very much, but any kind of sport was really fun with him. And again, motorcycling in particular, his love of the automobile by the time he reaches adulthood, that's something of prominent interest in his life as well. And of course, I have a slide up there, a picture up there of him as a boxer. He was a semi-professional. He had a checkered record. I think he had something like 28 losses in 58 bouts, something like that. Some of these he made no money on, obviously. Some he made a little bit of money. But if you think in terms of someone born in 1911, and by the time you get into the years of the Great Depression, which is basically shortly after he graduates high school, any means to make money was something that was going to help support him and his family make a living. Him and his mother in particular were the only two left to make a living. His father was a salesman for agricultural products out in the Midwest, and I believe that probably had something a great factor in why they end up being divorced. That he probably was not home all that often. He doesn't really desert his father. He does meet up with him on occasion through other periods of his life as an adult, but basically through a lot of his life, it's Bob Steele and his mother, or this wonderful tandem couple that move along in life. And I titled this slide Going to California because, as you can imagine, with the throes of the Great Depression setting in, they strike out for something better. Bob Steele writes in late 1929 that the effects of the Great Depression really hadn't caught up with the Midwest at that particular moment, but it didn't take long to really envelop the whole country. And of course, a lot of people are finding greener pastures in other places like California, and sure enough, that's where Bob and his mother end up going. He goes on sort of a scouting expedition, if you will, in late 1930. He puts his motorcycle talent to use, and we'll get into that a little bit more in just a bit. But he's able to put this motorcycling talent to use because he became a courier delivering correspondence for a bank out in Los Angeles. But again, his love of the motorcycle never deserted him. He actually took a ride from Kansas City before they moved, took a ride from Kansas City up to Springfield, Massachusetts to the Indian Motorcycle Factory. And he was treated royally. He really enjoyed looking at all aspects of the machine. It wasn't just riding the bike, it wasn't just racing it. It was also all the parts, all the moving parts associated with it. So he became a salesman out in Southern California also. So again, wearing many different hats, and he means to be able to have some sort of income. His mother followed out to Southern California in early 1931. She liked it out there so much that she basically stayed there for the rest of her life. She did travel a little bit, but once she became acclimated, she made friends. She enjoyed the neighborhood that she lived in, so that really became her new home base, basically for the rest of her life. And again, as I mentioned, Steele goes to work. He's a motorcycle stuntman. He actually got a part in a couple of Hollywood movies, just doing minor roles, again, for doing stunt work. And he did work for Indian Motorcycle dealership in Southern California, in Los Angeles. And he also puts his writing talent to use. And when you, hopefully when rather than if, you go to the Hartford Public Library and look at the diaries that he compiled from an early age, the humor just jumps off the page, and he's always cracking jokes about something. He keeps diaries, which is why we know so much about his life through these diaries that he kept, and all of these are just inflected with the humor that, if you certainly remember him being on the air on his radio program, the groan-inducing puns and the funny jokes and the slapstick and whatnot. That's also in his writing talent as well, besides his speaking ability. And he discovers at the age of 15 that he can make a little bit of extra money writing for a motorcycling magazine. So he comes up with this crazy column called Crocker Throttle Cracks. And he would write about different aspects of motorcycling, again, all for the entertainment, not just for himself, but also for his readership. It's a little bit difficult to see, but the picture there is from Motorcycling Magazine. And not only did Bob Steele write that column, but he also did the little artistry, the little cartoons. He was a wonderful cartoon artist. And he was able to enhance all his articles with this. There's always some funny, quirky twist to it. So in a way, he's almost a man ahead of his time, that he had not only this wonderful writing ability, but also the capacity to be able to draw. Motorcycle racer and hill climber. We know he's a boxer. Before they left Kansas City, Steele and his mother opened a small sandwich shop. Again, this is just as the throes of the Depression are taking over. I think they end up losing $500 in the deal, which doesn't sound like much today, but back then was a huge fortune. And it was just one of those things that kind of builds the ill reputation that a lot of individual businesses go belly up, and that was certainly the case with this little sandwich shop. But again, makes a little bit of money as a journalist for Motorcycle Magazine. And now we come to the Gold Star moment. I flagged this with a Gold Star because it's so important. As a motorcycle racer, you can imagine, and a stuntman, accidents are going to happen. He's probably lucky they didn't kill himself up until this point in his life. But he was injured one day, and he goes to a motorcycle track in Southern California, and just by happy coincidence, not only is he unable to ride that day because of an injury, but the announcer for the track that day failed to show up. So the track needs somebody to be able to fill the shoes and call the race, and Steele steps up to the microphone, and he does an incredible job because, again, that sense of humor comes shining through, as well as his knowledge of the races, the motorcycle drivers themselves. Again, he'd been doing this for quite some time. So all of a sudden, he curries this wonderful favor with the crowd. His voice becomes familiar, and this really sets him out to put his own self, put his voice in the public eye even more. In early 1936, a man by the name of George Lanham is trying to expand the spectator sport of motorcycle racing across the country. And George needs an announcer in a couple places to the east. So based in Southern California, again, we're still in the middle of the Depression. If you wanted a paycheck, if you wanted money, you had to follow the job. So he convinces Bob Steele to come to Hartford, Connecticut, and he arrives in mid-May. In the middle of the night, he gets dropped off near Bushnell Park, and he begins his career as a motorcycle announcer, race announcer here in Connecticut. I believe he also did work in Albany, New York. Again, a couple of days in Hartford, a couple of days in Albany. Again, you always had to follow the money. But by the end of September, when the racing season is concluded, he's going to go back to Southern California. And maybe it's by his own legend, or maybe by actual fact, because he did have a tendency to embellish things. He's waiting for his ride. September 30th, he's in downtown Hartford. He's waiting for his ride to pick him up to go back to California, and he was going to wander into the State Theater over on State Street in downtown Hartford. And the woman at the ticket booth indicates, she said, well, don't step into the theater yet for the second show because the movie is about to finish its first run. If you step in and see the end of the movie, it's going to spoil it for you. So he has a little bit of time to kill, and legend has it that he wanders across the street to the Travelers Insurance Company. And housed up on the 6th floor of the main north building are the studios, primitive at the time, but nonetheless, those were the studios for WTIC radio. And he wandered up there and just asked an innocent question, do you have any announcing jobs? They gave him an audition basically on the spot because Paul Morency, who would become his boss, he says, well, I've interviewed a dozen guys already, what's one more? You want an audition? Come on in. And he was on the air the next day. And the amazing thing about this, and I was able to find this in the archives at the Hartford History Center, is that it has the original 4-page application for employment that he filled out. So he has references to George Lanham. He has a brief resume, if you will, of his job experience. And he has places like Lanham's Motorcycle Shop, indicating also here that he was announcing the motorcycle races here, ready to head back to California, but he got a job as a staff announcer and basically stayed on the air from October 1st, 1936, practically till the day that he died in 2002. So he had almost a 66-year career. Not all full-time, of course. As he segued toward retirement in the 1990s and the very early 2000s, he was only on the air maybe once a month or so. He pretty much went by his own schedule. And of course, by the end of his life, his health was failing, but nonetheless spending decades and decades on the air at WTIC AM 1080. And again, he began his employment on October 1st, 1936. And when you look at Phil Steele's curated volumes, he does have a reproduction of the first page of the job application. But unfortunately, and this is why it's important to look at the actual documents themselves, printed across the top of the job application, it states, it must be understood by the applicant that the approval of an application does not carry with it the promise of a permanent position with this company. So here he filled out that same application. He was on the air with WTIC for 66 years. Quite astounding. And again, in today's job market where people just up and leave jobs at will, back then it was a different situation. And for him, it was just very ironic that the job application that he filled out was probably the only job application that he had to fill out from that point on for the rest of his life. And I also put there WTIC Hartford, Connecticut, USA. And some of you might remember when he gave a station ID that he would include USA as part of the station ID, which you don't have to do. However, I had the opportunity to speak with somebody very knowledgeable in radio history, and indicated in some of the documents I found was that WTIC's signal could be carried extraordinarily long distances if the atmospheric conditions were right. And it's called skywave propagation. Now back then, 1936, of course, there's hardly any television waves. There were a lot of 50,000 watt radio stations. I did find a directory that had a lot of radio stations, more radio stations back then than we have today, of course. But some of these were just extraordinarily powerful, and given the right atmospheric conditions, these could carry across continents. And supposedly WTIC signal was once or twice actually picked up in Australia. And supposedly there was a map in the studio, a global map with little pins placed wherever the signal could be picked up. So that's why he would include USA as part of his station ID. Rare occurrences, but it could happen. Now we come to the most important person that Bob Steele ever met. Her name was Astrid Shirley Hansen, and she was a resident of West Hartford. And Bob Steele, with his love of automobiles, was a guy who she thought owned a very fancy automobile. They worked together in the same building at the Travelers, and every day she would see this automobile, and they came into work at roughly the same time, and she thought that he was the guy that owned the fancy car. And then one day they happened to be riding the elevator up together, the main north building, and he runs into her and he's smitten by her. He says, "Wow, I have to take this girl on a date. I have to meet this girl." So when he asks her out, of course she says yes, because she thinks he's the guy with the fancy car. So you can imagine her disappointment when he shows up at her house on foot to go out on this date. But nonetheless, it still clicked. They were actually courted for a couple months, but then they end up getting married the following year. Again, it was quite a very interesting courtship, because as you can see by the envelope that I've reproduced there, you can see how fancily he drew her name, wrote the address in. He puts his own little cartoon character of himself up in the return address with the pencil going through his ear. And what else do you might notice there on the other side, the top right-hand corner? Special delivery stamp. This wasn't going to go by regular mail. This is going to go special delivery. So she meant the world to him, and they were both smitten. He convinced her, and they were married in 1937. But all the whimsy that you see on the envelope there, especially just the drawing and all the coloration that he did, really speaks to the artistry, to the wonderful outlook that he had, that he wanted to inject that sense of humor in practically everything that he did, especially when you're pursuing a woman. So he has his radio career, and after marriage, of course, Bob and Shirley, as she became to be more commonly known, went by her middle name, Shirley. They began their family, and in the meantime, Bob Steele starts to anchor his radio career on what was referred to as the G. Fox Morning Watch. It was sponsored by the old G. Fox department store. And in 1938, because Bob Steele is a sportsman, he comes up with an interesting idea. And again, as we were speaking at the head table during our meal, back then radio stations weren't 24-hour operations. I don't have the facts on WTIC of when they went to that particular format, but my own local radio station in Naugatuck came on the air at 6 a.m., they were off the air at 6 p.m. So if a radio station is going off at 6 o'clock at night, 6 p.m., you barely finished your supper, and what are you missing out on? Late afternoon sports action. Well, Bob Steele goes to his bosses and he comes up with this great idea. He says, what if we have an end-of-the-day sports show that is just a capsule summary of sporting events that took place during the day? And especially back then, a lot of daytime baseball. We hadn't gravitated into nighttime baseball the way we have it today. A lot of games are still played during the day. And Bob Steele likes to get this information. He likes to place a bet or two on sporting events. So this information, he's guessing, is probably important to a lot of people, but it's also important to him, too. So he goes to his boss, and they say, let's come up with this program called Strictly Sports. 15 minutes, end of the day, just review the scores that we can get, because don't forget, if there were games out on the West Coast, even minor league games they may have been interested in, they weren't going to get that information too quickly. But nonetheless, there was a timeliness issue involved here, so it was agreed that they would have this 15-minute sports show. I believe it went from 6:15 to 6:30, and then WTIC would sign off shortly thereafter. But this was really an innovative thing to have such a program dedicated only to sports at that particular time. And of course, the G. Fox Morning Watch would eventually segue into what became commonly known to many of us here, obviously, as the Bob Steele Show. And that would change a little bit over the years. I found in certain instances it would not begin until 7 o'clock, then it got backed up to 6 o'clock. And as we were speaking at the head table, I remember coming on the air at 5:30 in the morning during the weekdays, and I believe also on Saturday, and he would go off the air at 10 o'clock. So it was a full 4.5-hour show that it finally transitioned into. And again, that format would get tweaked over the years as he's segueing to retirement. He would only do the Saturday program, and then he would do one Saturday a month, and he often advertises saying, well, it might be the first Saturday, it might be the last Saturday of the month, we don't know exactly what. He would just dictate those terms by his own personal schedule. Bob and Shirley, as the family began to expand, they moved to a house in Weathersfield. They were at that first home for a brief time, but then they moved to a house on Walcott Hill Road, and they stayed there for the rest of their lives. They raised their 4 sons there, and in the photograph you can see going from left to right, we have Phil Steele at the left, Bob looking kind of Robert, as I refer to him, because I did talk to Robert also, the oldest son there with the dark sport coat on, Shirley with baby Stephen in her lap, and then the second son, Paul, at the far right. And as we were, some of us were talking beforehand, he became very noted for some of the features that he included in many of his programs, most notably the Word for the Day, that he and Phil also turned into a book. As colloquial as his mannerisms were, he always loved a pun, a good joke, but he was also very exacting when it came to proper English. So the ones that always stood out in my mind were, it'd be something like, the word for the day is athlete, not athlete, athlete, or sophomore, not sophomore, that sort of thing. That he would be very particular. And I believe it was Phil Steele, when I spoke to him, he mentioned something to the effect, if you heard somebody mispronounce something today, that would become tomorrow's word of the day because it would be fresh in his mind. But nonetheless, all these were accumulated and put into a nice little volume that became a really nice keepsake for people who were interested in all this jargon that Bob Steele liked to get so involved with. He had a feature on his program many days called Tiddlywinks, and he would go to the teletype and he'd pull these little funny celebrity notes or quirky occurrences that were of no significant historical or news impact, but it's something interesting that may have happened to somebody. Again, if somebody goes to the grocery store and they go to check out and the cashier accidentally gives them a $10 bill change instead of a single, something like that, and somehow it ends up making the news. He would take these items, he would pull them off the teletype, and he would rewrite them to be in his exacting standards, because when a script was handed to him live on air, it had to be letter perfect and punctuated properly, because he had no opportunity to rehearse that. He was just handed a script and had to read this on the air, and God forbid that he ever made a mistake on it. He didn't want to be flustered. He didn't want to have any confusion when he was doing this. And as Strictly Sports went also from a radio program to a television program, people think, wow, Bob Steele was on TV too. Well, he did make appearances beginning in 1957. When Strictly Sports became a TV program, he did not like TV. He did not like appearing on TV at all, because no tape programs back then. It was a live production, it was a live performance, and if you flubbed, not only were people hearing your voice making this mistake, they could also see the confusion that was going on. And he did not like that at all. Last presentation I gave, somebody asked that question. I heard that Bob Steele really didn't care very much for doing television. I said, that's absolutely true, because he just wanted to avoid getting involved in any kind of mistake like that. No school announcements. I had a lot of fun with this when the book came out, and I would call a particular public library, and if a person on the other end of the phone was of a certain age, I'd say, hi, I'm Paul Hensler. I just wrote a biography of Bob Steele, and I'm wondering if you'd like me to give a book talk there, a book presentation. And they'd say, oh, Bob Steele, the no school announcements, because they would remember that his voice was the one that delivered the news on those really stormy winter days, that there was no school in Hartford, there was no school in West Hartford, whatever. The fact is, yes, he did do that for quite a while, but that segued out and was given to other staff announcers over time. But many people still remember him. Again, if you're of a certain age, many people still remember that he was the guy that gave you the good news when it was snowing out that you didn't have to go to school that day. He became famous for noting the 80th birthdays of people. You could send your birthday in, or in the appropriate year, of course. You're turning 80 years old on a given date, and he would accumulate those and read those off. I believe he did 60th anniversaries also. So if you had a landmark birthday or a landmark anniversary like that that went very deep into years, you would get noted on his show. You can imagine that as a sportsman, he had the opportunity to talk to many, many big figures. He became well acquainted with Jack Dempsey. Among baseball personalities, many of the famous New York Yankees, including Babe Ruth and Joe DiMaggio, that he had the opportunity to interview. And if you think back to the day in the 1930s, not only was Bob Steele trying to get employment any place and every place to get extra cash, baseball teams did the same thing too. And on off-travel days, for example, if you had the St. Louis Cardinals playing the Boston Braves and their next game was in New York or Brooklyn, on that travel day, they'd be passing through Hartford on the train. And if they wanted extra cash, they could set up and play an exhibition game and pocket the funds. So when teams like this stopped in Hartford, it's an opportunity for Bob Steele to talk to Dizzy Dean, for example. And there's, again, when you look at Phil Steele's 10-volume set, and you look through chronologically, and you find these scattered all throughout, and there's Bob Steele standing at Bulkley Stadium. That's where the motorcycle races were held that he announced. That's also where the Hartford Senators played their minor league baseball games. That was a place that he could go to also to get interviews on the spot, and then use those interviews on his Strictly Sports program the following evening. So, does anybody recognize who the boxing figure is there? Willie Pep, yes. Born in Middletown, Connecticut, adopted home of Hartford. Became very well acquainted with Willie Pep. And Bob Steele also became famous for his time checks and antenna switches. These I remember because this is when I started listening to Bob Steele in the early 1980s. I think it was just before the sports on 6:45 or thereabouts. I think it was Peter L. Brown sponsored the antenna switch. And that was just a mechanism that the engineers would do to step up the power because now they were coming off of nighttime power and going to be using daytime power. So they had these antenna switches that they would do. They were so popular that they actually had sponsorships for those. And he became famous for what he referred to himself as the 100% wrong club. And if you were following a particular sports team, or maybe you had a big vested interest in who was going to win the Super Bowl or the World Series, you almost dreaded to hear what Bob Steele was going to pick, because usually what he picked was going to end up being the losing team. But his philosophy was this, and especially during the 1940s, the 1950s, the New York Yankees had such powerful teams that it always seemed like that they won every single year, and that was almost true. And his philosophy was, well, anybody can root for the Yankees because they win all the time, or almost all the time. He liked picking the underdogs. So he would go for teams like the St. Louis Browns, who did finally win one in 1944. He would go with the Chicago White Sox, who did finally win in 1959. They won a divisional title in 1983. So every once in a while, the underdog would really come through for him. But in fact, that's really what it was all about. He liked the underdog, and that was what he championed. That was his particular cause. And for him, here we are in a relatively small market. We're between a big media market in Boston, the biggest media market in the United States, of course, being in New York. And here we have humble Hartford, Connecticut, but yet Bob Steele, with his morning program, manages to garner the top market share 2 years running, I believe it was, in the early 1980s. He had the top market share. That's really quite compelling. You do have to understand, though, that the market share is not the number of listeners, but it's the percentage of the listening audience tuned to any given program. But nonetheless, this is still really a remarkable accomplishment after being on the air for such a long period of time and cultivating that audience, people that grew up listening to him, getting used to his routine. As we were discussing at the head table here, you could set your clock because you knew that the weather was going to come on at 7:25. You knew the time check was going to be at the top of the hour when they had that famous little beeping signal. All this was done. He finished his program in time for that time check to go on so they could go right to the news at the top of the hour and also half past the hour. All this had to be done by clockwork. So this is all part of the efficiency in the way that he made sure that the trains ran on time, if you will. He becomes a 1995 inductee to the Radio Hall of Fame. He hasn't made the Connecticut Hall of Fame yet, which still kind of rankles my skin, but nonetheless, there's nothing I can do about that. But he did make the National Radio Hall of Fame in 1995. An interesting story about that was that he was not crazy about flying. He had an interesting encounter going to Florida to call a boxing match because he was also a terrific boxing announcer. He flew down to Miami to qualify, and he was a little bit apprehensive about the plane flight coming back home because the weather was rocky, but who's he sharing the plane ride with? And became instant fast friends with Jack Dempsey. So again, as a boxing guy, you have the chance to have breakfast with Jack Dempsey on a plane flight, and then you get to visit Jack down at his restaurant in Manhattan many times. Again, this is all part of the networking that Bob Steele was able to do over the years. Upon his passing, part of Grove Street, the old Grove Street in Hartford, was renamed as Bob Steele Street. That still exists today. And maybe one of these days we'll find that Bob Steele is going to get inducted into the Connecticut Hall of Fame along with our famous basketball coaches Gino Auriemma and Jim Calhoun in that particular vein. Hopefully this will happen to Bob. One chapter that I liked putting together for the book was called The Sleepless But Amusing Life of a Radio Announcer. And this was a quote that was given in a particular feature article on Bob because it just describes so much of the dynamic that we see in Bob's life away from the radio that people may not necessarily be fully in tune with. Again, he is a diarist. Not every single day, but there are enough diary entries, enough diary books themselves at the Hartford History Center that when we start looking through those and see what goes on in the everyday life of Bob Steele, really gets a lot deeper into the man, the family man that he was at home, the absolute adoration that he had for his wife. Really incredible, the life that he led. He lived very well, of course. He made very good money. He also shared interest with family members, indicating that he got offers as a popular radio announcer. He could have gone to Philadelphia. He could have gone to almost any other market he wanted. But he was very content in Hartford because he liked the sure thing. He said, yeah, I can go someplace else and make a lot more money. But he said, what if I go somewhere and I'm not as popular? What if I'm not liked as well as I am here? So he was content to stay in Hartford because he liked the sure thing. And that was very, very important to him. And we learn about all these things through the diary that he left. We learn about Steele on the home front. He referred to, in later years after the boys were starting to grow up, he referred to Shirley as Mama. So when you read through the diaries, there are references to, Mama and I went out to the Hearthstone for dinner last night. Mama's, no wonder I can't lose weight because Mama's cooking a wonderful dinner tonight, or a wonderful dessert. So Shirley drops out of the equation, but she's replaced by Mama, that wonderful colloquial figure that just lends such a hominess to all these diary entries. And I mentioned that he's a figure filler because he loved keeping track of numbers. He was a betting guy. He liked keeping track of the scores. He kept track of receipts of how much certain things cost. He makes a notation, and I forget what year it was, probably sometime in the 1950s when they had the second house in Weathersfield, that he went and spent $110.38 on a new lawnmower, that sort of thing. And his diaries are just littered with this. We went out for dinner, we spent $21.62, and that included drinks and tax and tip. So he's definitely a figure filler. He just liked his numbers. He was in a car washing venture in the south end of Hartford, opened up the first car wash in Hartford, and he's keeping track of how, on a daily basis practically, of how many cars are being processed. And something happened that some of the machinery was broke. They couldn't be opened all the time, so they only processed 200 cars that day instead. They were hoping to have 300 cars or whatever. He's keeping track numbers-wise of almost everything that comes into his life. So that's an inescapable thing, too. And, of course, he's a wordsmith. We already know about the word for the day, but he loved old dictionaries. He loved, the bigger the dictionary, the better. And I had some of, not the huge ones that he came into possession with, but some of the older dictionaries that I remember myself having in the 1980s. They had glossaries in the back, or they would have listings of geographic places. They would have biographical entries of a way that you could find out how to properly pronounce a person's name or the name of a geographic place. And this was very important to him because as he was giving a news story or giving some sort of information on the air, he knew how to properly pronounce Uzbekistan, for example. You weren't tripping over that. Or he could look at something in German and pretty much have a relative high degree of accuracy of how that should be pronounced. This is all very important to him, and again, this was part of the educational process that never went away for the entirety of his life. He's a man of integrity. I was just recounting to myself mentally on the way up here that there was one year, for example, that he has to refile his income tax because he had discovered interest payment for a certificate of deposit, something like that, that hadn't been included in his net income from the prior year. So, and he writes that, we know this because he puts an entry in his diary for this. He says, I had to refile my taxes because I forgot this particular amount. He says, it had to be done, but I had to make it right. So he's a man of high upstanding character, and he expects others to do the same, even though he's not preachy on the air, but this is how he runs his own life. He does a lot of charitable work, especially with the Red Cross. He was a 10-gallon donor, and this was especially important during World War II. In Phil's diaries that he curated, there's reproductions of newspaper articles and, newspaper ads for the Red Cross, and picture of Bob Steele, and he's offering encouragement for people to go to the blood drive that's being held on Asylum Street or whatever in downtown Hartford. And he was not just encouraging people to go because he would go himself, that he was an actual donor. This was very important to him, and especially during World War II when blood was in such short supply. The puns and the self-deprecating humor, of course, everybody's familiar with that. When I talked to Robert, his oldest son, and Phil, they indicated something quite interesting in that when Bob was making fun of somebody, in particular, might have been putting in what we think today is politically incorrect digs at women, both Bob and Robert and Phil would tell me, he says, he was really making fun of our mother by doing that, which I found a very interesting take. He got in trouble a little bit at certain occasions like this, but if he was making fun, again, if you think of the Honeymooners television program and how abusive Ralph Cramden was toward his wife, maybe not, certainly not to that degree, but nonetheless, it's just the way the times were back then. And again, the 1950s, 1960s, Bob Steele's making fun of somebody. Chances are he's making fun of himself, or he's trying to poke fun at his wife. Working in the studio, I found to be very compelling. I was able to get a hold of several people that actually worked in studio with him. One, a producer, and another woman who was known as a continuity writer. And the continuity writers would write these on-the-spot scripts that would be handed to Bob Steele. Might have been an ad or a special announcement that had to go out. Those scripts had to be absolutely perfect. And again, as I mentioned before, he didn't have a chance to rehearse any of this. He would just be handed a piece of paper, and he had to read that flawlessly as if he was just talking to you, not reading something to you. And God forbid that there was the wrong homonym used, punctuation was out of place, that as you're reading it you would pause and sound funny, you would come across funny. He just absolutely abhorred that. And if that ever happened, once he finally got off microphone, once he had the chance to go off air, he would find the continuity writers, and he had a volcanic temper. So as much as we think of the lovable guy that he was, when things went wrong, it was not pretty in the studio. But by the same token, the same woman who told me that story also indicated that sometimes he would come into their area when he was off mic, and he would tell a joke just to get a live reaction, because she said, think about it, he's up at the microphone on the air, he can't get what the reaction is from anybody out there. It's not like if I tell a joke now and everybody laughs, I know it was something funny. But if he tells a joke, he has no way to get a reaction. So sometimes he would go into the office proper and say the same thing just to get that live reaction, get that interpersonal reaction with real human beings. So being in the studio was really quite enlightening for me. And the man who worked as a producer for him just described quickly what I also include in the book. Coming in the morning, he would get his cup of coffee, he would sit down with a couple newspapers, he'd look for those funny little tidbit items that he could use on the show later on. He would gather these little bits of information for certain segments of his program. All that was homework that he did on his own, and that usually happened before he actually went on the air to begin each program in the morning. The engineer would stack up all the tapes, because by this time they were using tapes for pre-recorded music. They would get that lined up. So all these things got melded into the program of news at the top of the hour, then he went to the weather, then about 8 minutes after the hour, then he would come on the air. They would maybe play one of his old-timey radio program music, something like the Robert E. Lee. Later on in hours that I was not able to listen to because by this time, 8, 9 o'clock or so, I was already in work, but he would have things lined up like the reading of the Albert and I'm missing the program now. The Lion and Albert?
The Lion and Albert.
The Lion and Albert, yeah, thank you. Little segments like that. Or Ralph Harris's Two Buffalo, that crazy song about the two buffalo. That was one of his favorites also. So all these things got programmed into his show. And from my perspective, I would always joke to my wife that I always knew it was Christmas because he would finally play the record of Jingle Bells by the Barking Dogs. That's when I knew it was Christmas, when he finally would play that. So again, all these little quirks that he would work into his program over time. And again, he's a man of emotions, usually very well mannered, very funny to deal with, very funny to listen to. But again, when things didn't go right, he could have a volcanic temper. And again, this all plays into his legacy. Because he was such a wordsmith, toward the end of his life, he ended up having his name put on the Learning Center in Hartford. For helping illiterate people become able to read. This is very important to him, just the same as remembering Cal Ripken Jr., the baseball player. He also founded a reading institution also. So again, that learning process is very important to him. The legacy that he built for the decades that he was on WTIC and the audience that he cultivated and the favor that he found was really quite compelling. And I do hope that he finds a place in the Connecticut Hall of Fame at some point. And coming down the stretch here, as I was writing the narrative, I ended up making what I call a couple of historical detours, things that I really didn't know up until the point that I was actually writing some of the narrative here. And by that, I refer to the development of radio, because radio was born almost the same time that Bob Steele is born. So the parallel track of their lives is quite interesting. Motorcycle racing as a sport was another one. I wasn't aware of how widespread it was. Not just the hill climbing, but cross-country racing. There was a couple husband and wife team that went cross-country. I believe there were 2 sisters that got involved with motorcycle racing. So this was really a big spectator sport and a participatory sport also. And again, I would not have been very aware of that until I got into writing of the book. The birth of WTIC, coming along in the earliest years of radio, very primitive operation, very primitive signal, but they found a home at WTIC, and a lot of corporations back then had their own facilities. In some cases, they didn't allow recorded music to be played in the earliest days, so that's why radio stations back then had their own orchestras that performed live music. And again, these little quirky things that you don't think about until you start digging more deeply into it. And again, the creation of television, especially in the era post-World War II, there is television in its most primitive forms beginning in the mid to late 1930s. But once we get into the boom times after World War II, all of a sudden now that starts to take hold more deeply. Again, we can't ignore that, even though that wasn't one of Steele's favorites, but he did have an active hand in it because he did promote his Strictly Sports program on the air. And it also speaks to the busyness of his life. He's not only doing the radio show during the morning, has lunch, maybe shoots some pool at lunchtime, goes back home, then he's back in Hartford to be on air. Again, this is all done live, to do Strictly Sports, first on radio and then on television in the 1950s. So he's an incredibly busy guy, and as he gains in popularity, he's an after-dinner speaker. He makes quick pocket cash because he's a popular guy. He's funny. People come to see him. He would try to discourage people from asking him by charging an appearance fee. And if you're organizing an event, you're selling tickets for it, you bury the cost of having Bob Steele into the price of the ticket. So every time he would come up with these little financial gimmicks to try to discourage people, they didn't care. You want to go to that event because Bob Steele was going to be the after-dinner speaker. It really came to having that kind of a reputation that he was able to carry forward. And lastly, I also mentioned the building of Constitution Plaza, which opened in 1961. You can imagine that with the radio studio and then a television studio on the campus in the main north building of the Travelers Insurance Company in downtown Hartford, space is going to get pretty tight. And that's not really what an insurance company was all about, not by that point in time. And part of urban development, the old original Front Street area, that was leveled. Constitution Plaza was built as part of urban redevelopment. Again, this was a program not particular to Hartford itself. There were a dozen cities across Connecticut that were undergoing this. Revitalization, the Chapel Square Mall in downtown New Haven, that was underway also in the 1960s. So it's not just particular to Hartford, but this is part of what's going along at that time for urban renewal. So old neighborhoods are scrapped. The mayor from Pontiac, Michigan came to Hartford after Constitution Plaza was open because this became one of the touchstone things. This is what you want to model your renovation to be like. You want to be like Hartford, Connecticut. So this became an important factor for other cities moving forward as we got into the 1950s and 1960s. We want to clear away the old and, out with the old and in with the new. And Constitution Plaza was a big part of that. Travelers has the ability to recoup some space in the main north building. Broadcast house is built. It's dedicated strictly to WTIC radio and the television studio. That eventually went away by the early 2000s. And I think the lot is still vacant. I think that might just still be a hole in the ground at the foot of State Street in downtown Hartford. But nonetheless, it served its purpose for many years as part of urban redevelopment. So I get into a little bit of that also. And it's important to put things like that in the narrative because it adds historical context of what's going on at the time, that these are the things that affect Bob Steele because he's part of WTIC and he's moving along with the radio station as well. And they're only over at WTIC Broadcast House until 1974 because then when the Gold Building is constructed, they moved their studios over there a block and a half away. So again, it's all part of modern progress. And they really did have quite nice studios. I was up at WTIC in the Gold Building a couple times over the years and it was really quite spectacular. So that helps to round out the narrative to give readers like you an historical perspective of not just Bob Steele, but the man and his times. And with that, as he'd like to sign off his program every once in a while, pip, pip, cheerio, auf Wiedersehen, adios, and all that stuff. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them now. And again, I have 2 copies. My last 2 copies left, $15 each. I'd be happy to sign them for you. So, any questions? Yes, sir.
I have a couple of recollections, one of which is he gave his weight every Friday on the air. And the other is I was once invited as part of a barbershop quartet to go down and do a singing Valentine on the air. And went down to Constitution Plaza. Bob came out and introduced himself to us during a commercial. And I was, based on his reputation and his popularity, I expected this huge, big office studio, and instead it was a room about the size of a large closet where he sat to do the radio program.
And what year was that?
I don't remember. It would have been probably in the late 1980s or early 90s.
Okay. And as he's segueing away from radio, this was something also that kind of irked him, that for such a long-standing member, he ended up, when he fell to part-time work by early 1990s, when he fell to become just a part-time staff guy, he got moved out of the office, and that didn't sit well either. And it kind of a sad reckoning of the passing of the years, that he didn't have that stature that he once had, and to end up sharing office space or sharing a desk, it really was kind of a blow to his ego. Your point about keeping his weight, that's in the diaries too. And he would have the colloquialism, I don't know if he went to a gym for his workout, but obviously you would have a scale that you could weigh yourself on, and he would make a notation before he worked out. He'd put in something like, went to the gym, 195 pounds stripped, S-T-R-I-P-T. Again, he just loved the colloquialism, and you knew what it was saying because he just would write it in phonetically. But he had a lot of weight issues that he would put in those diaries. So again, that all plays to the figure, Filbert. Yep. I don't recall him doing on-air announcements of that, but he was conscious of it because he kept track of it.
Yeah, every Friday morning.
Well, what I remember was he had a favorite song. And it was played usually to have something to do with his wife. I don't remember the name of the song, but it was a piece written by Ray Noble, and the singer was a guy by the name of Al Bowley. Anybody remember that particular song? I can't, but I remember those two facets. And that was something, it was one of his favorites, and he would play it maybe once every 3 or 4 months.
I,
Here one time we spoke, and he had us speak a little early because I think he wanted to be home by 9 o'clock because he had to be up early in the morning. Good guy. Very good, I enjoyed it.
Thank you. I always remember for the old time songs, Sailing on the Robert E. Lee. It was kind of done on sort of a honky-tonk piano and had a very bouncy beat to it. Very scratchy record. It probably was, if they weren't playing the original record, they were, I'm sure it's probably at least just a recording on tape to preserve the original a little bit better. But that was one that he would drag out every couple months or so. I just remember hearing Sailing on the Robert E. Lee and the Rolf Harris with the Two Buffalo. But this became very contentious. It's something else that we have to understand looking at historical perspective. He wanted to keep that successful, tried and true formula, and he didn't want to deviate from that. But by the 1980s, who's on air that's starting to eat into his audience? Not the older listeners, but the younger audience. Brad Davis. And the demographics were proven that if you're under the age of 40, you're probably listening to Brad Davis, and that as that audience expanded, there were fewer people listening to Bob Steele. So he's really digging in and holding on. And part of that was the musical programming that somebody age 30 doesn't want to listen to Sailing on the Robert E. Lee. They don't want to hear Two Buffalo. They want to hear, and I remember this distinctly. There was a song by the Cars, the group from Boston, Rick Ocasek and that band. They had a song called Drive. It was, Rick Ocasek didn't do the vocals on that particular song, but it just had sort of a slower, mellow beat. And I listened to Bob Steele one day, and they're playing Drive by the Cars. I'm thinking, where did this come from? And in the course of researching the book, we find out that Bob Steele and Jay Clark, the programming director, are butting heads now, because Jay Clark is telling him, you've got to update the music because we're starting to lose audience. And Bob Steele was gold. Bob Steele was revenue gold for WTIC for many years. So he knew what the successful formula was, but younger guys like Jay Clark, they were more in tune with what was happening on the bottom line and where the listenership was going. So this is why they wanted to tweak this a little bit. And Jay Clark insisted that anybody who deviated from the playlist that Jay Clark, developed would be fired on the spot. That was just an edict that was given. And I don't know if anybody lost their job, but that was the threat that it came to in order to wean Bob Steele away from the music that he liked so well. And again, going through his diaries, I find an entry, and I think this may have been in Phil Steele's books also, that the argument finally comes to a head, and Bob Steele finally steps away from it. He says, this is an argument I can't win. I forget how he put it. He put it very Bob Steele-esque terminology. It says something about, the loser doesn't get the loser doesn't get the clam chowder, or something like that. But that's what it came to, and he did step away because that was an argument that he was not going to win as time went on.
Well, Paul, thank you very much. Very entertaining.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.